seems from what I could see here is that it's everybody should be very familiar with the format. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this lunch hour global talks. I don't have to go over much detail here introducing this session in terms of the housekeeping notes. Just a reminder that although we are in this weird virtual space meeting on Blackboard, that we still acknowledge with respect to the Kwang-speaking people on whose traditional territory Yuvik stands, and the Songhees and Esquimalt and Bosanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. Also in light of what is happening, I think the importance of community, of land, of local relationships has become very clear during this pandemic. So all the more important to recognize on whose historical legacy we've built the University of Victoria and our home. And maybe we touch today in this presentation also on the legacy of Indigenous knowledge and practices in trying to help us tackle the climate challenge. So I think you're all familiar with some of the housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic and your camera unless you speak. You can raise your hand afterwards, or you punch a question or comment into the chat box. Both options are there. Would be great. You know, we are not a huge crowd, so it would be wonderful if you could actually use your microphone and your camera if you'd like to join us, creating at least some sense of community around this virtual table. So here you see, you know, the little dots, where you mute your mic, your camera, and where you raise your virtual hand to let me know that you would like to come in. So we record this session. I think we've now figured out the technology, even how to download a recording. So we are all prepared and make those recordings available afterwards. So the words of wisdom we're going to hear from John will be kept for eternity, at least, for the purpose of distributing them but further. This gives me the great pleasure of welcoming back John O'Riordan. I think very well known by now to all of you. John has been affiliated with the center in the role of the strategic advisor for the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, and we have been able to draw on John's expertise on various occasions. As you can see here from the slide, John has a very distinguished career in public service and as a former deputy minister, the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Management for the BC provincial government. And in this capacity, he has had many portfolios and many fields of expertise related to resource management, and more recently also how to respond to the ecological crisis that climate change, the age of Anthropocene, faces us with. And in this respect, today, he will draw on his experience as an administrator and think about what kind of government structure would be most appropriate to respond to the climate emergency, and whether we are prepared in terms of how our governments are organized and broader government structures to respond to this fundamental challenge. So with this, I would like to introduce and welcome back John. The stage is all yours. We're all ears. John, thank you for doing this on such a short-term notice. And you also had another meeting just before this one. All the more I'm thankful for taking the time today, for you taking your time and telling us about your perspective on what form of governments we would need to tackle the climate emergency. John, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Oliver. I hope you can hear me okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Maybe I just wanted to thank everyone for accommodating my change in time. I did have something else on at 11. So it's very nice to be able to do this at 12:30 and fit into all your schedules. And secondly, I've got a few ideas here and I'm looking forward to sharing them with you because you're a very valued audience. So what I'm going to talk about is a set of underlying principles that give some kind of sense of my philosophy towards governance and governments. And then I'm going to break in the discussion into three parts. One is, what are the elements of good governance for managing global emergencies? And I'm here meaning things like COVID-19 and the oncoming climate crisis, but any major global emergency. And the second form is looking at the current forms of governance and are they fit for purpose when you compare these to the elements of good governance, and I will say they're not. Thirdly, what kinds of creative solutions do we need to start to consider to reorient our governance models to deal with global climate emergencies? So these are the three sections of the talk. So in terms of underlying principles, governance is defined by myself anyway as a purposeful steering of society for the good of humanity. So it's a process, and governments are an institution, they're a means of achieving that steering of society, as are other institutions like the courts and to some extent education, but governments are seen as the most important, powerful element of steering society to a common good. Both COVID and climate change are global issues, and they require some form of global solution that can't be solved by any individual nation on its own. And in my opinion, the current governance models failed either completely to deal with COVID and more importantly, to deal with climate change, although that day of reckoning is still to come. Both COVID and climate change are linked to human meddling with natural systems, and there's an emerging body of science which links the changes in man and nature actions as a way of increasing the potential for viral epidemics around the world. I'm going to argue that some of the responses to the COVID pandemic have suited us better to deal with the pending climate change. In some cases, they show the weaknesses that we currently have in our governance models. And most importantly, in my mind, both of these pandemics require us to move towards some form of ecological citizenship or ecological civilization. So just for some context, the Paris Agreement requires that there be an annual reduction of roughly 7.8% in the global carbon emissions between 2020 and 2050 if we are to be on track to meet a so-called global temperature rise of 2 degrees or less. So it's instructive to my way of thinking that the current reduction for this year, 2020, even with the economy largely shut down at the global scale for up to 3 months, but over the full year, even with some recovery, it's anticipated that the carbon emissions will in fact be 8% below the level last year. So they will actually be on target, albeit at a huge cost. Just for comparison, the reduction in global carbon emissions for the 2008 crisis was only 1%. But it's notable that even with a change in carbon emissions in the last 3 months, there's been no detectable change in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And scientists do not expect to see that. It's still in around 416 parts per million and will not be dented in any way by what happened this year. But two other factors are in play here that in the global financial crash associated with the pandemic, equities in renewable and green technology actually have fared a lot better than equities associated with fossil fuels and old style living. And generally speaking, there's a trend continuing that renewable energy continues to be less expensive than fossil-based energy sources. So these are my personal assumptions, but they are important to have in mind because they reflect and affect the way I interpret governance in a changing climate. So I'm going to argue that if we were suddenly to be vaulted forward 30 years and did nothing new in terms of managing the carbon emissions, so we didn't achieve the 7% decrease each year, but we were crawling along at our current level, which may be about a 1% decrease, then I would say that by 2050, there would be immediately, you would see major shifts in water insecurity, energy problems, depreciating food systems, and likely mass migration. And so that what I'm saying is that the sort of impacts that COVID provided to us in March of this year would be in spades if we were to vault forward suddenly 30 years. The trouble is that climate change is like COVID in slow motion. And both COVID and climate change will have disproportionate impacts on emerging economies and the poor. So the people who are least responsible for these changes will be the most impacted. My second broad assumption is that GDP is simply too narrow a measure of human well-being, and that we need to increase the indicators of human well-being to include wellness, mental health, and others, and nature, rather than just economic factors. And thirdly, I think it's fair to say that humanity is hardwired and will delay massive mobilization of public resources till the threat is seen to be real. And I think it's fair to say that even though there were signs that the pandemic was beginning to have an impact in December, a lot of countries didn't really dust off their COVID response plans until February or March, and in many cases it was too late. And those countries like Vietnam and South Korea and Taiwan that did, and New Zealand, that did have a very active early start, had by far the most successful cruise through the pandemic. The other point I'm going to make is that while everyone talks about a new normal with COVID, in other words, there'll be some form of economic activity at a different level than it was in December 2019, but it will stabilize to some extent in the next 5 years. There isn't a new normal when it comes to climate change. The climate will continue to change for decades, no matter what we do to our carbon emissions. And so there needs to be a much more adaptive model of the economic base as we start to deal with climate change. And finally, a lot of people are placing a lot of faith on the youth and the youth movement to try and spur some action. I personally don't think that's fair. I think it's important that we, as who are the current decision makers and opinion leaders in climate change, make all the heavy going right now and give something for our youth to work from, rather than leave it entirely in their hands. This is a chart that I picked off the BBC website a few weeks ago. It shows in red that most people in most countries also consider climate change to be as serious a crisis as the coronavirus, even as it hits us. And that is an average of around 70–75% of the people feel that way. Interestingly enough, the countries that are not quite as at that level are ones that have a bit of a mixed policy on climate and public support for climate change. So here is the main part of my first phase is what are the elements of good governance? Well, first off, there has to be some long-term plan. We can't deal with climate change on 4-year election cycles. It just doesn't work. Now, we are doing that, and I'm arguing that's one of the reasons why it's not working. So we need a long-term transition plan that spans at least 15 years, and in my opinion, should go to 30 years and have 5-year updates so that there is a long-term strategy bought into by the voting public. The second point is, and I think we've learnt this from COVID, that we need science-informed decisions. So I've been very impressed that most, but not all jurisdictions have listened to the scientists, the public health officials, and based their political decisions on science. That is not, unfortunately, true of climate change. And there's a lot more dissension about climate science than there is about the science around the COVID-19. Future decisions need to be based on principles of ecological civilization. That means it's based on a broader metric of well-being, equity between individuals, nations, and developing economies. And it needs to be nature-based. We cannot live and continue to live outside nature's limits. Fourthly, there has to be some multilateral governance model that's effective. Climate change can't be solved by one nation at a time. It has to be changed collectively by all governments working in some form of multilateral level. And again, we've seen that's not been really effective to date. Fifthly, when emergencies come, there has to be some way in which decisions can be taken quickly with limited institutional oversight. We can't really be going into long, drawn-out battles in the courts about fairness and equity and whether or not all people have been fairly consulted if we're in an emergency. We have to be able to make fairly quick and rapid decisions, and that was clearly the case in COVID, where in the space of a week, we effectively shut down the Canadian economy, and there wasn't any question of going to the courts and people challenging their rights. Next, there has to be some form of global financing to support climate change. And that the best example I have is a Norwegian fund based on its oil revenues, which is around $1 trillion and something like 1.5% of the entire equity market globally. So it's a very significant fund. And it's now investing only in low carbon economy. And it's divested any money that it had in the Canadian oil sands. So we need that kind of fund with that kind of criteria for investment if we're going to be successful moving forward. And of course, we need transparency and meaningful citizen involvement. I believe that decisions should be taken by consensus. I'm actually, personally, a friend of proportional representation. I may not have support from all of you folk who are listening to this presentation, but I'm going to argue that in an issue as large scale as climate change, we need a national consensus on it rather than partisan bickering. And I would strongly support that we have a voting age down to 16 so our youth can start to participate in the franchise and not feel left out until they're 18. I am a strong supporter of private sector innovation and competition. I don't agree with shareholder value oriented corporate business, but I do think that a private sector that's innovative, that thinks in the long term and has a willingness to consider social and nature's values is a key part of the governance model going forward. And the final point I'd say is that there needs to be a hierarchy of engagement. We need to have engagement at the community, at the individual level, and then at the community level, and then at the institutional level, which would include schools and universities, and finally at the government policy level. I don't think that engagement at only one of these levels is sufficient. So I'm going to quickly run through 4 different models of governance we have today and see how well they stack up to these various criteria for good governance for dealing with emergencies. So I'm dealing first with the authoritarian mode of governance, which is represented mostly by China, to some extent Russia. And there are some aspects which I think are positive in dealing with climate. One is that they have a long-term planning horizon. So they have a 15-year plan, and they're even thinking of a plan to 2050. So they meet the long-term planning criteria. And I would argue that of the 4 models that we're looking at, they're the only one that's looking at a long-term planning as base to its governance model. They clearly have an ability to respond quickly to emergencies. They simply can override individual rights very quickly and make it happen. Their elections aren't dependent on public values and a change in public values. If they want to move, they move on their own accord. That's the governments I'm talking about, and impose their values on the public. I think there's some elements of innovation adaptation in the authoritarian model. So it may be limited because of the cons on the other side of this chart, but it's still there. And I've done quite a bit of reading recently, and I can't say I'm an expert, but I am aware that China has bought into the principles of ecological civilization. And it is trying to practice that in its approach to multilateral discussions, both on the Belt and Road Initiative and on the climate change Paris agreements. Now, this may be controversial for some of you, but I have a fair reading list that shows that China is trying to establish a series of principles that link harmony with humanity and nature. So I'll leave it at that for discussion later. Obviously, China and authoritarian governments have major problems in terms of human rights, transparency, citizen engagement, and oversight. So I'm not going to dwell on these. Nationalistic governments or populist governments, best exemplified by the United States today under Trump. And here on the so-called pros, there's some form of semblance to democracy, albeit rigged. Free speech is still around, and there are oversight institutions, and I think a fairly free media. They have a corporate model based on innovation, and they seem to thrive on crises, though I don't think they manage them very well. There's no long-term planning. As I mentioned, the elections are rigged, and this is going to be no different in the fall of this year. There's increased inequality as a result of nationalistic policies. There's a politically divisive culture and clearly a disdain for multilateral institutions. And in terms of the COVID response, nationalist governments have by far the poorest record of any of the four forms of governance. Liberal democratic governments are those which are generally speaking exemplified by Canada here and most of the Western European governments. They obviously have free elections, independent institutions, science-informed decisions. They can make shifts in short-term crisis when the crises are perceived and accepted by the public as a whole, but maybe not if they're not perceived and trusted by the public. They're elected by popular vote. They generally support multilateral institutions, and there's a lot of opportunities for citizen engagement, but they rely on trust. And I'll argue that those liberal democratic governments that had the most successful COVID response had it because they had a trusting populace that supported them all the way. So countries like New Zealand, Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea, and to some extent Canada, had that level of trust, and countries that didn't have that level of trust, like the UK, have failed to be as supportive and responsive to the COVID pandemic. The main problem I have with liberal democratic governments is that they're elected every 4 years. They're elected by popular vote, and they're dependent upon the perception and values held by the voting public. So the voting public don't see climate as a big issue and aren't willing to make lifestyle changes or major policy shifts such as carbon taxation, for example. Then the governments simply can't act, and they get voted out by other parties that have a shorter term and more populist approach to policy making. And then we have the multilateral governance models, which largely looked at by the UN, and that's a group of governance models, and to some extent the EU. And these are potentially, they can engage the global community at some level. There's a sense that they at least understand the concept of it, we're all in this together, so they're not nation by nation. They thrive on collectively strong governments that support them. And if there is a range of governments that are weak, then their multilateralism is deficient. They can do some long-term planning. I don't think they do sufficient in climate change because they're beholden to some of the weakest links. And they, generally speaking, have a basis of collective science making as the basis for making their policies. But on the con side, they have limited authority to hold nations into account. Individual nations, as we can see from the States, can just simply leave the multilateral pact and go on their own without sanction. It's difficult to gain any universal change in consciousness through multilateral governance models. And I think the World Health Organization probably has a bit of a mixed track record in dealing with the COVID pandemic this time around. So at best, their response to emergencies is mixed and certainly not yet fit for purpose. So before I move into the final section, which is dealing with what are the creative solutions in governance, let's just have a quick cross-check between COVID and the climate emergency. So I'm arguing that COVID is providing a bit of a rehearsal for climate emergency, and I think most of us are surprised by the significance of government intervention worldwide, at least into the economy in the short run, to try and shore up the effects of the pandemic on livelihoods. The trouble is climate emergency is that the tipping points aren't known. So we knew where the tipping points were with COVID. We just don't know when we're going to cross planetary boundaries, and we probably won't know until after the fact, and it will be too late. The other thing is that we've seen a large loss of life down in the States now, 100,000, and yet there's no perception in the mind of immediate loss of life due to climate change. In COVID, there was some form of democratic consent for the lockdown. There's a lot less consent for the opening up of the economy, if you've certainly seen down in the States. And in climate change, it really is difficult to get democratic consent because the risk factors are so much more complicated than COVID, and people have different perceptions of risk and therefore different attitudes towards policy solutions. Under COVID, there, as I mentioned, there will be some form of new normal, especially when a vaccine is established and available globally. But there isn't a new normal, or nor is there a single solution for climate change. It's a process of adaptation, which is going to continue for decades. And we're not yet prepared to have a continuous adaptive governance model, in my mind. And both COVID and the climate emergencies have shown that there is an undue impact on the the weak and the poorer societies and poorer nations. And that is a major issue when it comes to climate change. So in terms of my creative solutions, I'm looking at two sets. One on this page, we need to shift to a nature-based economy, an ecological civilization. We're, according to some of the scientists, we've already moved beyond 4 of the 9 Earth boundaries. And if we continue to cross these, it's going to be very difficult to end up with a climate that is fit for the kind of humanity we've been enjoying in the last century. As I mentioned before, we need a broader set of well-being metrics that measure nature's values as well as economic values so that we can trade off between the two. We need a global trading system that has a joint targets for meeting carbon and ecosystem restoration goals. For example, carbon tariffs where people aren't meeting these goals. I think we've seen in the COVID experience some form of collateral and collaborative science across nations, which bodes well for that kind of collaborative arrangements, but I don't feel that our current trading arrangements allow one country to say that I'm only prepared to trade with you if you have similar policies with respect to carbon reduction. Although we're beginning to see some countries placing meeting carbon targets as a criteria for getting support for the economic restitution post-COVID. Another model which I personally support is the limiting policies to certain areas where they are fairly easy to achieve and have major impacts on either reducing carbon emissions or increasing carbon sequestration and global ecosystem restoration. So decarbonization of electricity could arguably be done worldwide in the next 10 or 15 years. And once that's done, the transportation system could follow to be largely based on electrical systems rather than gas and natural gas and petroleum. And similarly, with ecosystem restorations, there are tremendous gains to be had if we reforest large areas of the globe, and China has started to do this. And if we change the soil conditioning to one where we capture carbon rather than lose it in the way we support our agricultural systems. I'm a big fan for carbon tracking, both at the national level and the individual level. And I'm looking forward to working on a carbon model where anybody could track their individual carbon footprint through some form of carbon card, which would be similar to a credit card, except its currency would be in carbon, not in dollars. And then people would be able to set yearly targets of how much carbon they're going to use and create some models about how they can reduce that by 10% a year over the next 20 or 30 years. Based on my review of the Norwegian model, we need new financial tools based on climate risk management to help the emerging countries adapt to a changing climate and also pole vault to immediate emerging technologies instead of going through risk-based technologies. And I'm hoping that our friend Mark Carney can provide that kind of financial analysis in the work he's doing with the United Nations after he leaves the Bank of England. And in this chart, the final slide is the need for some form of universal education on climate and biodiversity science. I've long been a fan of trying to make climate and biodiversity science a core part of all curriculums. So no matter what subjects people take in universities, whether it's music, philosophy, English major, engineering, or medicine, that they have a basic understanding of climate, ecology, and biodiversity science so that they become world citizens. It's not sufficient to have a few people graduating with a degree in environmental studies and consider that to be adequate education. So in terms of, this is my final slide, in terms of the governance models, obviously I favor multilateral collective action, and I'd like to see the UN stiffened in order that it can become more effective. But I think an interim step might be what's called either called plurilateral, i.e. a number of countries but not all countries, or polycentric governance, which is basically the same thing. And some of you will remember the presentation by Ted Parsons last week where he talked about at least two scenarios where he talked about plurilateral government models. One was the 6 nations, which included Canada, that would band together to start some form of geoengineering because they were fed up with not getting any sufficient action at the multilateral UN level. And the 6 of them would be strong enough collectively to actually have an influence on global affairs. And I think he also had a second model which had 10 vulnerable countries that were more exceedingly vulnerable to climate change, and a bit of a mix of haves and have-nots, but they would act as some form of plurilateral governance model to throw their weight into affecting the way multilateral governments work, and they would have enough clout to to impose their own tariffs on trade, and they could even create sectoral agreements for electric vehicles and fertilizers and that kind of thing. And I think certainly polycentric governments could combine to do research, and arguably the most effective research that we're seeing is done at the UN level. There has to be, in my opinion, a governance model that has both top-down learning and bottom-up learning. So we need listening circles where policies are shaped by both people working at the community level, expressing their values, and then bringing these up to the governments, and governments then establishing them and bringing them in and implementing them in the public good. And they should be policy focused so that they have maximum impact on the climate scene. We need to reduce inequality, and as part of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and that has to be included some kind of financial sharing of resources to get the poorer parts of society up to scratch to deal with the climate emergency. That's to be a universal education and training programs, because millions and millions of workers will have to shift jobs in the next few years from fossil-based economy to a green economy. So there's going to have to be large-scale innovation, but more importantly, large-scale retraining so that people have a just transition. And we'll probably need some form of basic income, which may well emerge from COVID, to allow people to tide through that transition with some form of secure economic base for a few years while they get retrained. In my mind, Indigenous reconciliation is a fundamental part of a just transition and an appropriate governance model for dealing with emergencies. And we are beginning to enter that in Canada, but it needs to be globally as well, because the UNDRIP applies to all Indigenous people around the globe. And finally, as I said before, we need effective community engagement. And part of the reasons why I'm so engaged in my Climate in the Arts project, and my wife's name is that, to engage people at the community level through our videos and try and bring a more complete awareness of what's in the pipe on climate and get them to vote and act accordingly. So, Oliver, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Wonderful, that you give us such a comprehensive sketch of what some of the major governance challenges are and how we could possibly address it, and relate it back to the lessons that we learn currently from COVID. Maybe some opportunities do come up, and some of the lessons that we've learned over the last difficult months could be carried forward. You spoke about a rehearsal for the climate emergency that COVID provides. I think there's lots of things to chew on and to consider here. Who wants to lead us off? And I think it might be the best if we just unmute our mics, but please feel free to leave also a comment or a question in the chat box. But who would like to start us off with a discussion? Please raise your hand, and I'll invite you in to unmute your mic and have you speak. All right, Mabel, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we do. Good to hear you.
Good to hear you too. Hi, John. Thank you very much for such a great speech. A lot of thinking out of it. I'm curious about the chart that you showed of whether countries agree or disagree climate change and COVID-19 are related. If I remember well, Canada wasn't at the top of countries that agree. It was more kind of at the bottom of that chart. Just curious if you have any thoughts on the why of that result, and what could that represent for Canada's understanding and action on climate change? Thank you.
Hi, Mabel. Actually, I don't really have a lot of insight. That chart was taken off a BBC website, so I don't have the background why Canada was, I think, equal with the states in terms of the public perception that climate change was in the same kind of emergency as COVID. So I can't speak to it in any more detail than that. But it was interesting that a number of many other countries had a much greater public concern on climate change than the average Canadian population.
Thank you, John.
There's clearly, fascinating research to be made, to think about when do these challenges rise up to an emergency, and how does public discourse, a presentation through political elites as well impact this. But I don't. Next is Nicole. Please, Nicole.
Hi, John. Thanks for the talk. These are some really great solutions around governance, and I think a lot of what you talked about were what could be done, but I'm interested in the how. How do we get from where we are now to make those institutional or policy or institute those policy mechanisms to be able to have those creative solutions? So I'm wondering if you can answer a little bit more on the how we get from where we are to where we need to be better. Oliver's laughing because I'm always asking questions like this, but how we make that transition.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I think you're laughing at me. But anyway, two factors in my mind how we get there. One is that I actually am more optimistic about governance tackling climate change now than I was 4 months ago before COVID. I think COVID response has shown two things. One is that governments can act quickly and comprehensively when forced and when they actually see emergency. And secondly, I think that systemically there's going to be a change in public behavior as a result of the COVID experience in terms of air travel, tourism, working habits, and transportation. And all of these will trend in the direction towards lowering, on the margins anyway, the carbon footprint we have collectively. But more importantly, I think people are now aware that what we had before COVID really was not fit for purpose, and that we had a lot of problems in our lifestyle and consumer habits, and we need to start to change these more fundamentally. So if governments were willing to be more bold in their post-COVID policies towards carbon, I think they got the population as a whole might be more receptive to supporting them, as was the case in the past. But the other big issue from my point of view continues to be education and awareness. And until public become aware that the crisis to climate is just as real and is just as pervasive as COVID, and then they will start to vote differently. They'll vote to some people who will actually do something about this, and they'll be more receptive to engaging in a policy debate and coming to a consensus. So my sense is that there's a more fertile soil to be tilled now post-COVID, but we can't let our guard down. We need a more aggressive educational and engagement policy to get the voting to change to more substantive policies.
Thank you, John. Robert, you're next.
Hi there, folks. Good to see you all. Hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yeah, Robert. I guess you're joining us from all the way from the other coast still, right?
Yeah, I'm still in Halifax, but there's sunshine here, so that's okay.
Right on.
So, John, thanks for your talk. And I saw that my head was sort of going up and down, and just nodding in agreement with all of the suggestions that you've put forward. And part of me is thinking again, kind of to Nicole's point, how do we actually get this done? Just to build on your one point about the fact that GDP isn't the way to measure success to get this job done. Is there a role then to actually look at just how inequitable the global economy is? One of the things that's come up in this time right now is that Mr. Bezos is making pretty good money out of the crisis right now. And in order to engage in some of these proposals and these ideas that you put forward, what about the role of addressing the just global inequality of wealth by looking at elite characters like Mr. Bezos and others?
Well, I mentioned the there is a need for some kind of global fund. And one of the weaknesses of the 2015 Paris Agreement is that the so-called Global Equity Fund to help emerging countries adapt to a changing climate never took place. It's supposed to be by 2020, which is this year, $100 billion a year, every year, being put into adaptation to help developing countries change their agriculture and water systems and food delivery systems. And so I really think there's going to be a push by Carney and his group, A, to look at the risks of not including climate, and B, to encourage both the public and private sector to get serious about a transition fund that will move us into a more adaptive way of doing business. I don't see a solution without some form of revenue sharing and asset sharing between the rich and the poorer countries.
Great. And next is Oliver, and then Rob.
Of course, I have to add some fodder to the fire here. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm very lucky, as you know, because I get to sit and have lunches and drinks on decks with you, so we discuss some of these issues. But I'm going to put you on the spot a bit, and I'm going to really try and amplify Nicole's question. I'm going to ask you two related questions. The answer may actually be the same for both, but let's find out. And my question would be, if you had only $1 to spend or one thing to do right now, where would you start? So we have a long list, but what practical one thing do you think is the first in the sequence of dominoes that needs to fall? And related to that is the question, imagine you're talking to a group that maybe we're at a university that have a center that are involved in global studies, that maybe the director might be on the line. Let's pretend you were going to give that director some advice about an area of research that a center that studies global things might engage in to help fulfill your vision, assuming we agree that your vision is correct.
Well, of course my vision's correct. That's why I gave it. But there are two answers to your question, so it's not the same answer. My answer is, if I had $1, where would I put it? And I would put it in a universal education system to bring people up to speed on the climate and biodiversity emergencies, so that within 10 years, everybody understood all of the factors that are at play. In terms of global studies, I think there's a rich opportunity in the National Borders Initiative of Global Studies to look at what forms of pluricentric governance across borders would be the most effective way of combining power sources to make policy changes towards climate and biodiversity change.
So just a quick follow-up, just to be clear, when you're saying this polycentric or this, you're not talking multilateral, you're talking basically a coalition of countries with like minds who might collectively engage in a collective policy engagement or program that would not be appetizing to the multi, but will be more than just individual state by state.
Well, first off, yeah, I'm talking about nations with some kind of common purpose and common values banding together, because it's quite clear that it's inefficient and cumbersome to try and get 167 states to think the same, unless there's until the emergency is so real that it will be far too late to do much about it in terms of climate. But what I'm saying is that this so-called pluricentric or polycentric means that there's enough common bonds between enough states with enough clout collectively that they can actually influence all the other states. So in other words, they could, if they wanted to, have a compact that they would say that anyone doing trade with these same set of states would have to pay a carbon tax. If they're trading with any of the, let's assume there's 10 major states, EU, Canada, Australia, and a bunch of others, they had a collective commitment to doing something serious about a carbon tax. They would say that if you're going to do trade with us in the future, we will impose a carbon tax on you equivalent to what we've put on our own citizens. And so they level the playing field. That's what I mean.
Oliver, are you happy with the answer?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a great starting point. More grist for more decks.
Right on. Here you go. Rod, you're next. You might, follow up on this or, taking us to a different direction. Rod.
Well, I guess it's following up in the sense that it's asking how do we get to these destinations that most of us would agree are desirable. When I saw the title of the talk, I was thinking we might be going back to Vincent Ostrom and polycentric governance, 1961 and onwards. And the ideas have been around there for quite a long time. Eleanor, of course, took them way forward in moving not from polycentric as sort of horizontal, the interactions of a large number of different jurisdictions at a single scale, but rather into the vertical, into the nested institutions kind of argument. But the ideas have been around from her work for quite a long time without really seeing us get much further in an effective way to deal with the major difficulties of, as John mentioned in the talk, the big differences in perceptions that the individual citizens have, and the big difference in the circumstances, and the difficulty of bridging those differences through any kind of talk, negotiation, or deliberation. That they're, to be more specific, I mean, the idea of a World Atmosphere Fund has, Ted Parson and I did a paper on that coming out of the early meetings in the late 80s and 90s. And there have been other proposals along the same lines since to try to support the transition internationally, globally, in dealing with climate change and global change more generally. On the metrics question, Marilyn Waring's been on that for a very long time, and even we got it to the point where the French Prime Minister commissioned a very high-level commission headed by Joe Stiglitz and French economist Fiduci, which made a very persuasive case for the need to move away from GDP. We had Buzz Holling in the 70s arguing for taking readings on ecological indicators, salmon stocks and that sort of thing, and reporting on that rather than the Dow Jones numbers, which matter somewhat less. But we have had, in effect, these ideas around in these various dimensions for a long time. And I'm a little puzzled as to how we see the experience with COVID as giving us very much more optimism that we can bridge the differences in the citizenry around what action to take. So I guess it's not really so much a question as a puzzle as to how do we translate these ideas into action that will have some impact in a democratic setting.
So Rod, a couple of comments. One is that if you want to see one country that is actually genuinely trying to include a multi-dimension set of indicators in its budgeting, then look at this year's New Zealand budget. So it was just tabled about a week or two ago, and they explicitly brought in measures of mental health, social mobility, economic GDP in the traditional sense, and some aspects of nature-based values. And it's not, from what I'm reading, and I'm not an expert on their model, but from what I'm reading, the government is actually using the budget tools and these broader set of indicators to change the way they govern. So I would say that is the first example I'm aware of where a government is actually formally bringing in multiple values and using them to direct policy. And the other country, I'm pleased to say that is well on the heels of New Zealand, is Scotland under Nicola Sturgeon. And she's committed to bringing in a budget that's based on well-being principles. So it's interesting that we have two female prime ministers who are willing to take an adventuresome role in a new approach to broadening the indicator wealth that is used for policymaking. And I just take my hat off that they're starting the ball rolling. On the Ostrums, I mean, I've read some of their material and I see that more as risk management and ways in which polycentric organizations can share the risk so that if anything fails, it's likely that if there's 5 different government models for delivering a service, at least one of them will not fail, even if the other 4 fail. So it's a way of spreading the risk. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for the model, and it actually isn't hypothetical, because if I'm not mistaken, Rod, and you're a great guy for public administration knowledge, Chrystia Friedland, when she took over as when she was foreign secretary, she looked at some form of compact with a number of countries, including the UK, that were committed to phasing out coal-fired electrical plants by 2030. And so she actually formulated some kind of a compact with 4 or 5 countries that had a similar policy, because as you recall, Canada in its pan-Canadian climate plan had as one of its policies to phase out all coal-burning plants by 2030. So there is some precedent that countries have started to share values and use them as a way to try and encourage other countries to follow suit.
Thank you. Rod, did you want to follow up? I saw your hand. We go to Ted. Ted, do you want to come in?
Hi, thanks, Oliver. Hey, John, very much appreciated. Informative and engaging and provocative as always. Just a couple of things. There's so many. I tried to take notes as we went along here, and a number of comments. But maybe just kind of following up briefly on the GDP and the whole metrics question, particularly looking at a more nature-based approach. Of course, the proposal for genuine progress indicators has been around for a long time. I deal, as you know, or a lot of my time is spent down at the local government level. You probably know the work of Bill Reese, Dr. Reese over at UBC with the ecological footprint. At the local government level, you may know Dr. Jenny Moore out of BCIT. So there's 10 cities in BC right now that are undergoing an ecological footprint approach, as well as a consumption-based inventory approach. So certainly on the ecological footprint, a metric to look at the impact of cities and their citizenry on the consumption of nature, to be able to provide any range of consumptive goods, including food, and food's certainly a big part of that. Sorry, I'm just looking at another. Oh, right. Yeah, and that's actually an initiative that Dr. Jenny Moore is taking on right now. Is looking around the world at a local government level and trying to find that elusive tool out there that can best indicate that how cities are, to the extent they are or need to, live within the Earth's carrying capacity at a kind of a metric level nationally. You may know of the UK carbon budget, which is done on a kind of a political basis. I think it was like every 5 years, and they started in the mid around 1915 for argument's sake, and every 5 years they hold their government's feet to the fire by saying, well, here's your budget, here's your carbon budget for the next 5 years, and for the first 2 terms they've been staying within it. They're not too sure of the next term coming forward, but that's a way to use a metric that is not just a long-term IPCC 2030, 2050 target, but something much closer, and certainly something we haven't really tackled here in Canada in terms of a carbon budget, but certainly following some of that kind of leadership in other places of the world is something we arguably could and should adopt. And then another one that just jumps to mind in terms of nature-based accounting and the like is again, you probably may be familiar with it, is called the MNAI. Started out of the town of Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, and it stands for the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. And it's a way to bring in and quantify and value nature in your municipal budgeting, so that you're not just saying, okay, it's going to cost $3 million for a water main or water infrastructure system, but if we've already got endowed by nature, as far as say absorbing water runoff and the like, then we'll estimate the value of that and try and preserve and or enhance nature so that we don't have to pay for a $3 million water main system next year or 20 years from now. So that's just a couple of examples on metrics around nature that jumped to my mind.
Oh, very good, Ted. Yeah. I'm not that familiar with Jenny Moore's work, but I'm certainly very familiar with MNAI, and I've been tracking that well. And so I'm a big fan that valuing natural assets will be an increasing factor. I'm hoping it's going to be a big factor in a green infrastructure push following the COVID epidemic.
Right. Yeah, hopefully so.
Let's go to some questions that we have in our chat box. You know, Benjamin asked two questions. Let me read them to you, John. My first question is about BC at the political and administrative level, how to control the forest lobbies, elimination of clear cutting, which impacts climate change, and lead them to a reformed forestry with priorities, ecosystem services, and so forth. So lobbying as, you know, a potential roadblocks in some of the government structures and responses that you described. And the second question is it possible to change lifestyles, housing, energy systems, and transport without breaking out of financial neoliberalism? So, you know, bring it back to our organization of the economy and the financial service and banking system. Do we need to aim for very profound changes along those lines?
Well, dealing with forestry first, it's a bit tricky because current government policy is under the Forest and Lands FERPA, the Forest Range Protection Act, is that any environmental enhancement or restoration can only be done without unduly affecting the commercial logging cut of the forests. And to me, that's not a sustainable policy. And I think there's some work now being done by government to look at whether or not they need to change that under the new lens of reconciliation. And so there may be some work being done to make that a bit more flexible so that some aspects of forest management would be allow for a reduced carbon harvest cut. I mean, we've got a precedent of that because on the Central Coast in Haida Gwaii, there was a major reduction in the annual allowable cut because of eco-based system logging, and that was part of the agreement between the First Nations and the government and the citizenry on these on the Central and North Coast. And so that, you know, we have done that, but that is a kind of a ring-fence policy for the coast. It's never been applied elsewhere in BC. In my opinion, it has to go in that direction. On the infrastructure, I'm not that familiar with infrastructure financing. I do know that there is actually more money available than we think. Right now, we're applying it to the wrong things. And I think it's quite possible to find money to adapt to a changing climate within the fiscal reserves that we have. We just have to start changing what our priorities are.
Thank you. Go to one more question from our chat. that's from Abel. In some cases, systems models of governments at higher levels, national, for example, reflect what is happening at other levels, the society as a whole. If we wanted to begin implementing some of our ideas, could we take as a pilot an institution, for example, university, municipalities? So, probably also, how do we start the process, to go through multiple levels of governments, and whether we could use key institutions as testing grounds, as models for how to tackle some of the challenges that you described.
Oh, well, I would agree with that, because as Ted Sheldon pointed out, the town of Gibson spearheaded the Natural Assets Initiative. So there was one municipality that took upon itself to do a pilot project, and it explained that across the UBCM. And now, I don't know, there must be about a dozen pilots already in play around various municipalities across Canada where are using a natural assets approach. So we need some municipalities to start to look, as Tej said, on different forms of indicators, maybe through Jenny Moore's work, and act as exemplars, get other people to come on board. I have a bee in my bonnet about the education system, because I came to the education system late. I was a public servant for 35 years, and then I went in and taught at UBC starting in 2005. And I tried to get a course in sustainability and carbon management and climate change and biodiversity. That would be a beginnings of a universal course that would be applied throughout the curriculum. And it just didn't work. There's too much people with their own pet projects on their curriculum and didn't want to be moving around. But I really do feel, and I was completely surprised, and I taught for 10 years, graduate students, what I consider to be illiterate understanding of climate and biodiversity by students who are actually oriented in this area of research, because they were students in planning and resource management. But compared to what I was learning in government, in terms of what I think they needed to be ecological citizens, they were woefully poorly educated and poorly knowledgeable. So I think a lot of work has to be done in the next 10 years to give a more cohesive base to climate, and it should be tailored to the nature of the skills sets that they're developing. So I don't know to what extent the Center for Global Studies wants to take any of that cause on, but it would be nice to see a slightly more universal approach to understanding policies leading to climate and biodiversity change globally.
Thanks, Ron. That's quite a mandate to have. Let me see. Ted, I think if you want to come in one more time, and then we gradually bring the formal discussion to an end. If you want, you can still hang out afterwards. But Ted, do you want to react to the last thing you heard?
Well, I guess two comments. One, I got a bugbear on the education side too, as you can imagine, John. But maybe I'll shift my my comment to I loved your reference to Norway and their Norwegian fund, right, the $1 trillion or so, and then your reference to pulling money out of the tar sands. I'll use this as a somewhat comparable or comparative. So there's a number of folks on campus here, and you probably know them, that work with, say, the CCPA and the BC chapter, right? The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I had a recent, well, I guess not that recent, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, with Kelvin Sanborn. And a lot of you folks know him over with environmental law. They just finished publishing a little something in the Narwhal that said that the average Canadian is subsidizing fossil fuels in the country to the tune of something like $1,650 a year. Over to the CCPA, they've generated a couple of reports that certainly jumped to me in and around pensions. The first was the CPP, so the Canadian Pension Plan, and the other John, you and I might relate to this one, the BC IMC, the BC Investment Management Corporation, which certainly holds my pension, that a substantive amount, a significant amount goes to, again, investing in fossil fuels. And you made one comment about infrastructure and priorities, and you're absolutely right. And another one is leveraging money that is available to put to good cause, right, or the common good and the like. And certainly pension funds, I think Quebec is doing a lot in that area, where they're putting their money, good money, to where their mouth is, etc. And of course, on a personal investment side, do we know where our investments, our investments, we have different investment portfolios, but where are they going? So just the whole issue of the power of personal up to international. And international, you're one example about we're falling short on the $1 billion committed through the Paris Agreement to start in 2020. So it's an important leveraging tool to put towards good common good, both locally and internationally. It's more of a comment, I guess.
Yeah.
No, they're great comments, Ted. I'm not going to comment other than to say that I'm looking forward to following up with you at our own time.
Betcha.
All right, let me thank John more formally for this presentation. Wonderful contribution and lots of food for thought, as you could tell from the questions. We were going to watch to what degree the current crisis will transform and open up new opportunities actually for an intervention also on the climate file, and whether some of the lessons learned over the last couple of months will prove to be instrumental in rethinking government structures and responses. So, John, thanks again for this. What I suggest is we leave this forum open for a couple of more minutes. We can't really substitute our coffees and the talk in the hallways, but if people feel so inclined, please feel free to use this chat, and also if you want to unmute your mics or your cameras and make them work to do this. But thanks again, John. That was wonderful.